Okay, so we've got two things going on in the United States at the very same time in this period. On the one hand, we've got big strides toward national economic unification. But on the other, that unification is encouraging more regional distinction across the United States. And if that sounds confusing, don't worry, because I'm about to Heim-splain it real nice for you. So, if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, so as we've seen in this unit and in the last unit, there's a persistent tug of war in the early republic between whether it's the United States or the United States. In other words, in the late 18th and early 19th century, one of the main arguments among Americans was whether national concerns or regional concerns were more important. And in this period, we see both developing at the exact same time, and so let's start by considering the efforts of legislators to strengthen the national economy. Oh, and by the way, if you want note guides to follow along with this video and all my videos, check the link in the description. Okay, first of all, remember from the last video that thanks to Napoleon kind of giving up on France's presence in the Americas, he went ahead and sold the US the Louisiana Territory real cheap. And that did a lot of things, but one of the most important things it did was to open the Mississippi River to US merchant ships so that they could get their trade on up and down the western frontier. And this got even better when steamships were introduced, because now the trade vessels could travel upriver as well as downriver. Anyway, that development really benefited Americans in the South and the West, but it ended up hurting Americans in the Northeast because land routes between it and the Ohio River Valley were less attractive to merchants owing to the difficulty of overland travel compared to water travel. Although, to be fair, with the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, which connected the Northeast with the more western farms, that difficulty would certainly lessen. But regardless, in response to the Northeastern economic melancholy, Congress approved the construction of the Cumberland Road in 1811, which would facilitate overland trade between Maryland and Ohio. And look, I'm not just flapping my mouth whole about federally funded infrastructure for funsies. No, I save that for my daily podcast, Infrastructure Schminfrastructure. I said more canals. No, the reason why this is important is because all of these developments work to link the various regions of the United States into an interdependent economic whole. For example, southern planters could more easily transport their raw materials, most notably cotton, to the factories in the north, and northern manufacturers could more easily transport their finished goods to sell in the south and the west, and so on and so on. So all that to say, in this period we see the construction of metric buttloads of roads and canals, all of which just kept knitting the various regional economies tighter together. But for sure, the granddaddy of all legislative programs to boost the national economy was the introduction of a series of policies known as the American System, proposed in 1824 by the Speaker of the House from Kentucky, our boy Henry Clay. Now, just like I mentioned earlier, the American System was just another effort to grow the national economy and simultaneously knit together the regional economies into a tighter interdependent whole. Now, it was definitely a complex set of policies, but you really need to remember three of its main emphases. First, the American System proposed a dizzying array of federally funded infrastructure projects paid for by tariffs and land sales, which would include roads and canals that would benefit farmers and merchants in the South and West. And then second, Clay proposed protective tariffs to stimulate domestic industry. Now, what in the fresh heck is a protective tariff? Well, a tariff is a tax on goods imported from other countries. And the protective part of it means that the tax is high enough on those foreign goods that people are more likely to buy goods made in America. So the tariff protects American manufacturers and gives them an economic boost. What's that? You want a concrete example? You know I got you, boo. Behold the Tariff of 1816, which, if you're paying attention, does come before the formal introduction of the American System in 1824, but it's still part of the overall package. Anyway, the Tariff of 1816 was passed in response to British merchants flooding the American market with cheap manufactured goods. You see, they had a large stockpile of goods that had been building up as the result of Jefferson's Embargo Act and the War of 1812. And so they sold these goods to Americans at a fraction of what they were worth, and American manufacturers could no longer compete on prices. So Congress passed the tariff, which raised prices on those British goods and made Americans more likely to buy American-made goods. But the thing to remember about this tax is that it was the first tariff enacted whose main goal was not to raise revenue for the federal government, but instead to protect and bolster domestic industry. And so, because this tariff was framed not in terms of the federal government seeking profit, but rather as a matter of national security against Great Britain, it was pretty popular across the various regions of the country. However, in the next couple of videos, I'll tell you how that support started to wane as the economic situation of the country began changing, but alas, I get ahead of myself. Anyway, the third part of Clay's American System was the establishment of the Second Bank of the United States. Now, Hamilton's First Bank of the United States was created under a charter of 20 years, and in 1811, Congress did not renew that charter, so the bank went the way of Alexander Hamilton himself, which is to say, it suffered an early death. So Clay proposed the creation of a second national bank to regulate public credit issued through local banks throughout the nation. Additionally, the bank issued a national currency, and all of this worked to bind the various regions of the country together into a tighter national whole. And at the same time, it promoted regional specialization. In other words, it encouraged each region to do what they were best at doing. The North should focus on manufacturing, the South should focus on the cultivation of cotton, and the West should focus on food production. Okay, so up to this point, you might have the impression that regional differences were starting to disappear as a result of this big national hugfest. But here's where I tell you, not so much. No, this unification of the national economy actually worked to bring out the differences between the various regions. You see, since the infrastructure to connect the various regions was multiplying rapidly, each region could specialize in what they did best and rely on importing goods from other regions to make up for what they lacked. For example, in general, southern states specialized in agriculture, and in this period, cotton became the dominant crop grown and exported from the south. And then northern states majored in manufacturing and depended on importing raw materials from the south in order to produce those manufactured goods. But with the overcultivation of the southern soil, many planters took their enslaved laborers with them and moved west. And with the cession of Florida to the United States via the Adams-Onis Treaty, they moved further south as well. And then many of those planters who did not migrate west shifted to the sale of enslaved people to the western planters, since by 1808 the international slave trade was banned. So the point is, the fact that regional economies were becoming more distinct also made them more unified, since they needed each other in order to prosper. But despite all of that, the growing regional distinction meant that regional attitudes about economic policy and slavery contrasted sharply, and let me give you an example of each. First, in terms of economic policy, let's talk about the Panic of 1819. Now, a panic is an old word for an economic depression, and this particular panic was caused directly by a slew of irresponsible practices carried out by the National Bank. You see, its regional branches in the West had been reckless about loaning money to Western farmers on the assumption that economic growth would continue and the farmers would be able to pay back what they owed. Now, this is what we call speculation, and it's a very risky gamble, especially for a national stinking bank. In essence, these farmers borrowed more money than they had collateral to back it up if things went bad for them. Anyway, in 1818, the National Bank wanted to tighten up the money supply in the United States and reduce the amount of credit available to its regional branches. And for all sorts of complicated reasons that you don't really need to know, that act led to a rapid financial collapse as banks called in their loans and farmers were not able to pay them. The result was mass foreclosures on farms, which then led to financial hardship in the manufacturing North, since they were no longer able to receive the raw materials they needed. And so when Congress started debating about how to best solve this problem, regional differences flared up quick, fast, and in a hurry. Northern manufacturers wanted more tariffs to protect their industries from international competition, but Southern planters argued that the tariffs would raise prices on goods that they needed to survive at the very time when European demand for their agricultural goods were decreasing. And then many common farmers felt that their needs were being ignored as elites argued about how to best protect their own interests. And so for many Americans, this panic led to a significant mistrust of the expansion of federal power, especially represented by a federal bank. And then second, regional differences also flared up with respect to the question of slavery. Now, as you probably know by now, slavery was the dominant labor system in the South, and to a growing degree in the West. But the dominant labor system in the North was wage labor, also known as free labor, to contrast it with enslaved labor. And I don't really have time to explain the intricacies of why each one saw the other as a threat, but just know that they did, and that we'll come back to that in a future video. Anyway, this antagonism between enslaved labor and paid labor was held in a delicate balance owing to the equal distribution of these states' senators in Congress. In 1820, there were 44 senators in Congress, and they were equally split between slave state and free state interests. And they found a way to live together with that kind of balance, even if it was uncomfortable sometimes. But then something happened that freaked everybody's crap out. The Missouri Territory applied for statehood, and as a territory, slavery was permitted. So the assumption was that Missouri would join the Union as a slave state. But that, of course, would tip the Senate balance in favor of slave states, not to mention that because of the 3/5 compromise we talked about in Unit 3, a new slave state would also boost their numbers in the House as well. And so the northern states were, to put it mildly, not happy about that. But don't worry, things are about to get worse. Yeah, the tension was increased by the introduction of the Talmadge Amendment proposed by New York Congressman James Talmadge, and it stated that Missouri could enter the Union only on the condition that it banned slavery and then gradually emancipated the enslaved people that already lived there. So Southern congressmen flat out rejected the amendment, and so Northern congressmen retaliated by refusing to admit Missouri as a state. And you have to understand the stakes here, because Southerners felt that this move was an existential threat to their own political power. You see, since the Northern population had grown at a much faster pace than the Southern population, Northern states would always hold a majority in the House of Representatives, since seats in that house are gained by population. And so the balance between the North and the South in the Senate was the only hope they had at protecting their interest in maintaining and expanding slavery. But if Missouri came in as a free state, then the Senate too would tip in favor of Northern interest, and to Southerners, that was a big heck no. But don't worry, because here comes Henry Clay riding on that noble steed called Compromise to save the day. Yes, it was Henry Clay who introduced the Missouri Compromise, otherwise known as the Compromise of 1820, and there are two important effects of this legislation that you need to remember. First, the compromise would admit Missouri as a slave state, but also admit Maine as a free state, thus upholding the balance in the Senate. Second, the path for the future expansion of slavery was codified. It was agreed that from here on, the 3630 line of latitude, which was Missouri's southern border, would create the geographical division of slavery in the United States. Slavery could exist below that line, but not above it. And as it turned out, this compromise was enough to make everyone kind of happy, but it wouldn't be long before those same debates flared up again as more Americans migrated into the Louisiana territory, but next time it would be worse. But I get ahead of myself. We'll have to save that juicy tale for another video. Well, okay, you can click here to watch my other videos from Unit 4, or you can click here to grab my video note guides, which are going to help you get all the contents of this course firmly crammed into your brain folds. And hey, I'm glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.